Welcome back. Joining me now on our political panel is the Shadow Parliamentary Secretary Jamie Briggs and Labor MP Kelvin Thomson. Thanks for your time, gentlemen, this morning. First to you, Kelvin Thomson, on electricity bills and the Prime Minister's plan. We're already seeing evidence of what may be another long, hot summer. Is reducing reliability of the network to bring down power bills really worth it if it means that the grid fails, for example, on the hottest days of summer?
Well, of course, no one's interested in seeing the grid fail, David, but it is clear that there has been overinvestment in the networks over the course of the last decade or so, and that gold plating of the networks is causing higher prices for consumers than is necessary. As recently as October this year, the Productivity Commission found that spiralling network costs was the biggest driver of rising electricity prices. And indeed, way back in 2010, I gave a speech in the Parliament calling for action in relation to electricity prices, where I pointed out that during the previous decade, prices for consumers had risen by more than 100% in both Sydney and Melbourne, so more than double the CPI. So it does seem to me that action on electricity prices is warranted, and I think it's great that the Prime Minister's got this on the agenda.
I suppose my point is that even though it costs a lot of money to, as you say, gold plate the network, it does make for a very reliable network, and we know that some of these networks on the hottest days do fail.
Yes, there are weather circumstances which can make failure unavoidable, but of course it's the job of those in the electricity industry to minimise that, minimise disruptions, and they have everyone's support in relation to that. The point is that we have seen gold plating of the electricity networks, which has been observed and reported on by independent authorities. So I think that giving the electricity regulator the powers and the resources to match it with the electricity companies so that we can avoid that, I think that's a good thing. I think electricity consumers will want that, and the idea that we could reduce an average electricity bill by $250 a year if we can secure agreement with the states to get that kind of resourcing and action in relation to electricity price regulation, I think everyone would want to see that.
Jamie Briggs, leaving aside the carbon tax, $250 a year in savings, should the states stand in the way of that?
Well, does anyone believe that this Prime Minister will deliver on this promise that she's made yesterday? This is just another political promise from a Prime Minister who is desperately trying to change the subject away from the fact that she told the Australian people before the last election that there would be no carbon tax under a government she led. She can immediately have an effect on electricity prices tomorrow by abolishing her carbon tax, which has no environmental gain but just pure price pain for Australian families and their households.
And Jamie Briggs, it does allow Julia Gillard, though, or give her the opportunity to slightly decouple or further decouple the carbon tax from the electricity price rises that we've been seeing for years. Is that something that is going to play to her advantage?
Well, look, we'd be happy to talk about the carbon tax and its impact on electricity prices every day between now and the next election, because there is a stark point of difference between our side of politics and the Labor Party. The Labor Party promised there would be no carbon tax under a government that Julia Gillard led after the last election, and in the dodgy deal with their coalition partners, the Greens, they've inflicted this carbon tax and its pain on the Australian people. She can immediately have an effect on power prices today if she announces the abolition of that tax. Now, as far as the reasons for the increase in prices across the network charges and so forth, I mean, Kelvin Thomson says, well, you know, it's gold plating and uses these terms. Well, actually what happened over the last decade was power companies had to catch up with the infrastructure, because for so many years state Labor governments in particular were taking all the revenue and not investing in the network from their companies, and therefore when pensioners and older people on 40-degree days wanted to use their air conditioners and couldn't in places like South Australia. Electricity companies said, well, you know, we don't think that's acceptable, so they went and built a better network. That's what the Australian public expects and deserves, frankly.
OK, well, I want to move on to the AWU affair, which dominated proceedings in Parliament yesterday, last week, I should say, the final week of Parliament for the year. And I want to ask you, Kelvin Thomson, is the AWU attack, which looks like it's obviously going to go on, harming Julia Gillard? It certainly messed up her agenda last week to finish the year on a positive note, on a triumphant note even, with a number of bills through the Parliament.
What the AWU issue represents, David, is the opposition thrashing around looking for a plan B after their plan A, which was to delegitimise and blow up the hung Parliament and prevent the carbon price from coming into effect, after their plan A failed. But really, all that thrashing around wasn't Tony Abbott waving, it was Tony Abbott drowning. The fact is that at the start of the year, Labor was as far behind as the Australians are against the South Africans in the third test, and yet now we're neck and neck. There has been a stunning transformation, and the opposition's plan to blow up the hung Parliament has failed. This doesn't represent any kind of plan B. I don't get contacts in my office or from emails from people who are concerned about it. I thought their use of the all-important last week of Parliament to talk about this issue was a spectacular political blunder. There are all sorts of other issues that they could be talking about. Today there's information about obesity, that 64% of Australians are obese or overweight. That's a serious health problem. There are problems in the public transport area. Yesterday I was reading that if we don't have investment in Melbourne's public transport network within the next 2 years, then people on the Werribee and Sunbury and Dandenong lines and so on won't be able to get on the trains in years to come. So there are all these other sorts of issues that they could be talking about and should be talking about, and yet they're talking about an issue which is of no interest to ordinary Australians at all.
Sure. Well, Jamie Briggs, the opposition leader Tony Abbott has in recent months changed tack and tried to present a more positive agenda. Did the AWU affair last week harm his attempt to sort of to present that positive agenda? It ended on a negative, or at least on the opposition attacking the Prime Minister rather than talking about the things that Kelvin Thomson was talking about just then.
Well, Kelvin's obviously got a long interest in state affairs, and he continues that interest with the issues he's just mentioned. But in relation to the questions that we asked last week, they are legitimate questions. This is a scandal which has never had anyone charged or police action taken against, thousands and thousands and thousands of dollars of missing money, missing employer levies which were taken inappropriately and misused. Now, you know, there are reasonable questions when a Prime Minister was the chief legal advisor for the establishment of this of this entity. So that's what the Coalition did last week. At the same time, we've been talking about our positive plans for the future to ensure that Australia can have a stronger economy, that we can have secure borders, and then we can enter the next decade in a position of strength. Now, Kelvin said just before, and something I agree with, next year there will be a choice for the Australian people. There will be a choice between this government, which has wasted so many billions of dollars on schemes like pink bats and overpriced school halls, or a coalition who will live within its means, who will again invest in confidence in the Australian economy and will secure our borders. There is a stark choice for the Australian people next year, and bring it on.
Well, the latest Galaxy poll shows that, once again, it's Kevin Rudd and Malcolm Turnbull that the people, according to the poll at least, believe would make the best Prime Minister. Kelvin Thomson, why don't voters get to see an election between leaders that they want to lead the country?
Oh, David, the Parliamentary Labor Party had a vote about the leadership issue earlier this year and resolved that question. I think the some of that polling ought to worry those in the opposition. The fact is that with Tony Abbott as leader, we've now got a neck-and-neck political situation, whereas if you go back a year ago, they were believing that they were a sure thing. So that's something that plenty of them will need to reflect on over the break.
Jamie Briggs, what do you make of this latest Galaxy poll, again showing Kevin Rudd and Malcolm Turnbull, more particularly for you, in front?
Well, I love Kelvin's definition of neck and neck. I think the poll was 54-46, which would, I think, be historically the biggest election loss in the history of the Federation. So if Kelvin's definition of neck and neck is 54-46, well, maybe he needs to contact the Macquarie Dictionary and get them to change the definition.
OK. Jamie Briggs, Kelvin Thomson, thanks very much for your time this morning. And thanks for your company too, watching AM Agenda. I'm David Lipson. The latest headlines are coming up right after this. Thanks for watching.